Hey, we're getting a bit of an early start this morning. Actually, when we started chapter 7 last week, I just felt the need to really slow things down. And the reason for that is understanding the future. And the best way to understand the future, or more clearly see the future, is to understand the past. And so we're going to slow this down. We're going to rehash what we learned last week, and then get into where I think we're only going to go about halfway through chapter 8 this morning. But what we see is a bit of a drilling down, if you will. You know, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and Daniel interpreted the dream, and he's seen this huge statue with a head of gold. And of course, we know that the golden head represented Babylon. And then he had a chest and arms of silver, and that represents the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Iranians today, is modern-day Iran. It was a Medo-Persian Empire, two different ethnic groups, but one nation. It was the Medes and the Persians. And then we got into the belly of brass, which represents the Greek Empire, and the legs of iron representing the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was never conquered. It just kind of faded out. But as we see from Daniel's prophecy, and that's why we have two different legs, as we see from Daniel's prophecy, there's going to be a rebirth of the Roman Empire. Maybe not in the same form as it was, but in some form, there's going to be a rise of the Roman Empire. There's going to be a 10-nation confederation that's going to be established. And out of this 10-nation confederation will come the Antichrist. As Daniel has drilled down, he's kind of given us clues to that. But then we went into chapter 7, and he gives greater description in describing in what is coming. Of course, this was all prophetically speaking in Daniel's time, but as we've looked back, we know that a lot of this is our history. You know, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Roman Empire. We see a lot of that in his history. We've yet to see the rise of the Antichrist. But what we're going to be seeing as we get deeper into this prophecy, Daniel's becoming more and more specific as to what's going to happen. And that's why so many scholars today look at Daniel's prophecies and say, this couldn't have been written any earlier than 50 A.D. But the problem with that is Jesus made many references to the book of Daniel, and we also have the Septuagint, which was written in 287 BC. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So we find it there in the Septuagint. So this could not have been written before the events unfolded, or after the events unfolded, because we have the Septuagint, and then also Jesus making many references to the book of Daniel. But what we see, and as we get deeper, and as we began to see last week, Daniel is becoming more and more specific as to what is about to take place. And again, it's very important for us to understand this history if we're going to understand prophecy. Daniel is one of the key books to understanding the book of Revelation. And so that's why I want to slow this down, recap as we move forward. I want you guys to see this and understand. Because the more you see this history, the more hope you're going to have for the future. Amen? So last week we were looking at Daniel's prophecy. He had already given the prophecy of this huge statue and given us details, as to what this statue meant. But then in chapter 7, we don't see a statue, we see these creatures, these beasts. But these beasts has representation to each part of the statue. So going back to Daniel chapter 7, we'll pick up in verse 4. Of course, Daniel chapter 7, this was the first year of Darius. Now, as we get into chapter 8 this morning, we're going to be moving into the third year of Darius. Not Darius, Belshazzar. So this is actually taking us back before the Medes and Persians had invaded Babylon. So he's going back. He's describing some dreams that he had. And Picking up verse 3. I said verse 4, but it was verse 3. He says, "And 4 beasts were coming up from the sea." The sea is always a picture of the Gentile nations. Anytime you see that, this becomes important in the book of Revelation. In fact, it's the book of Revelation that defines this part in Daniel. The book of Revelation tells us that the sea is always representative of the Gentile nations. So rising up out of the Gentile nations that Daniel is declaring, he says there was a lion. There was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. This is the Babylonian kingdom, represented by the head of gold. The lion with wings is always a picture of Babylon, and it's a picture of Babylon to this day. When I was in Iraq, I seen these images everywhere, on military documents, on signs in Saddam Hussein's palace. Saddam Hussein believed he was actually a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, his currency had his image and Nebuchadnezzar's image in the background. He thought he was a reincarnation. But the lion with the eagle's wings is always representative of the Babylonian kingdom. I kept looking until the wings were plucked out. Of course, this speaks of the time when Nebuchadnezzar had rebelled against God, when he became prideful. God, basically whacked him out. He began grazing in the fields like an animal. But then he repented, and God restored his senses. Picking up now verse 5. "And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear." This represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire was this great beast. I mean, it is represented by a bear because it moved very slowly as it went along, conquering all these kingdoms. There was 2.5 million men in the Medo-Persian army. That's how ginormous this was. And it would just move through the desert. And taking out all these nations, they'd move in wave after wave after wave and just totally annihilate anyone who stood in their way. So we have the Medo-Persian Empire, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth, and thus they said to it, "Arise and devour much meat." So this is what happened. The 3 ribs representing Babylon, representing Egypt, and representing Lydia. So this is the Persians come in and wiped out these conquering kingdoms, if you will. Verse 6, "After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard." What's that? Oh, okay. "Another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads." Of course, this is the Greek Empire. This is Alexander the Great. He comes in with 35,000 men, an army of 35,000, and is able to go in and destroy Artaxerxes' army. And of course, the 4 beasts are the 4 generals that would come after Alexander's death. So, continuing on, and he says, "After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong." He can't compare this beast that he sees in his vision to any creature that exists. He just describes this thing as being absolutely terrifying. Of course, what he's describing now is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would come in after the Medes and the Persians and rule with an iron fist. They would destroy people. They were extremely strong, he says in verse 7. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. It speaks of the 10 toes, the 10-nation confederation. Of course, the belly of brass was Alexander the Great, or the Greek Empire. Continue on verse 8, "And while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one." This is speaking of the Antichrist. And as we get deeper into chapter 8, he's going to be more descriptive of the Antichrist by giving us, telling us what was about to happen in his near future, but it's also a picture of what will happen in the latter days. We're going to be looking, next week, we'll be looking at Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a type, a picture of the Antichrist. We're going to be looking at some of the things he did, in which will be similar to what the final day Antichrist will do. Again, it's so vitally important we understand what's happening here so that we can better understand of what's coming in the future. He says, okay, so Daniel sees this beast that he can't even describe with any kind of animal like a leopard or a bear or a lion. He sees this extremely terrifying beast, and this is the one that he kind of zooms in on. He wants more information. So he's asked the angel Gabriel, he's the one that he's actually speaking to, who's giving these pictures and these visions. He says, verse 19, he says, I desire to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, extremely dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were in its head, and the other horn, the little horn, which came out, and before which 3 of them fell, namely, of course, what's going to happen is the Antichrist, and we see this just kind of repeated as it's sprinkled through the book of Daniel. We see that there's initially this Antichrist is going to come on the scene, and there's going to be a 10-nation confederation. But out of this 10-nation confederation, 3 kingdoms are going to resist. There's going to be 3 kingdoms. We don't know what they look like today. We're beginning to get maybe some hints, as we see the footage in the news of what they might be, but that's all we're doing. We're speculating at this point. But when the Antichrist, and that's why we can't know, because we're really not going to see this until the Antichrist actually comes to power. But guess what? We're not going to be here. The church is going to be raptured up, taken out of the way, and then at that point, because the book of 2 Thessalonians tells us, and it makes reference to the book of Daniel, that we cannot know, the Antichrist cannot come to power until the church is taken out of the way. So, anything we see today is purely speculation, but it is getting excited. It's very exciting. Because one of the things we can see happen is the Ezekiel 38 war. The Ezekiel 38 war. And that's exactly some of the things that's happening in Israel right now and the nations that's coming together right now, either for or against Israel, is in the book of Ezekiel. But it's the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 38 war, that will eventually introduce the Antichrist. So one war that we might see is that Ezekiel 38 war. It's the bookend. It's the start of the Great Tribulation. And of course, the end of the Great Tribulation is going to be the Battle of Armageddon. So it's very exciting to see and understand some of the things that's written in Daniel, in the book of Revelation, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Some of the things that we could see, but there's also good to understand the things we won't see. We won't see the Antichrist. But anyway, Daniel's describing this little horn, and it talks about the 10 nations that come together, and there'll be 3 that will initially resist. Verse 21, he says, I kept looking, and the horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. We'll see this again later in the book of Daniel. There's the Antichrist is going to come to power. He's going to make a 7-year peace treaty. But in the middle of that 7-year peace treaty, he's going to break it. The 7-year peace treaty being with the nation of Israel. He's going to break that peace treaty, and then he's going to go after the Jew. He's going to try to wipe the Jew off the face of the planet, much like a type of Antichrist did, Adolf Hitler. He's going to try to wipe them out. Because all this is about, this entire Old Testament is about God's promises to the Jew. The church is in there. But everything that's written in the book of Daniel is about the Jew. Daniel, the angel Gabriel, will go on to tell Daniel, he said, everything that's happening here is about your people and your holy city. Now, we know there's been a whole lot more kingdoms than the 4 that's identified here in the book of Daniel. We've seen the Mongolian kingdom, we've seen the British kingdom, we've seen all kinds of kingdoms, the United States and Russia. None of these countries are necessarily mentioned, as the coming power or ruling and reigning. Because the things that's happening right now in the church age is not about the Jew. So therefore they're not written. But this Roman Empire is going to come back to power, and God's focus goes back to the Jew. Right now, we're the saints, as we see in the New Testament. But once God takes the church up out of the way, his focus goes back to the Jew. They are the saints. They are the sanctified ones. They are the set-apart ones. But anyway, he asked specifically about this, and Daniel gives him some details concerning the rise of this Antichrist. And then let's go ahead and read verse 23. Thus he said, the 4th beast will be the 4th kingdom on the earth, the 4th beast being the 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth. That's what the Roman Empire did. And tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns out of this kingdom, 10 kings will arise. Another one will rise after them. And he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue the 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High. He will wear down the saints of the highest one. Of course, he's speaking about God and his sanctified people, his set-apart people. And he will intend to make alterations to times and laws. I mean, we see this happening right now. Right now, they're trying, even in America, we see this attempt to wipe out our history. To tear down statues, to make alterations to law. Now men and women men can marry men, women can marry women. We see this all kinds of stuff happening that is preparing the world for this coming Antichrist. But he will come in and he will make these laws, he'll alter times, alter laws, and make it all about himself. Because he's basically going to come and say, I am God in the flesh. He's going to be imitating Jesus. And he's going to be speaking blasphemous. He's going to be a military genius. He's going to have intellect. He's going to have this communicate, unlike Brian. He's going to be able to communicate very well. These oratory skills. This guy, men and women are going to fall in love with him. He's going to have this mass following because he's going to make all these promises. And people are going to be buying into it. Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians what's going to happen once the church is removed. There's just going to be this diluting influence that's going to fall upon people. So they'll believe what is false. But he's going to be much like Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler had Germany convinced that, that he was the greatest leader to ever live. So too the Antichrist will not just convince Germany, but the entire world. There's going to be this great war. He's going to come in as this peacemaker. He's going to convince everyone that he's got all the answers. And he will make peace in the Middle East. He's going to do what no other man has been able to do. He'll make peace there. He'll make the promise of peace at the least. It's going to be a 7-year peace treaty. But again, 3.5 years into it, he will break it. So, I said I was going to slow down. So we've had these images, this image of a statue, these images of 4 beasts, and he's drilling down. He's giving us more and more detail as we move along. Now we're moving into chapter 8, and in chapter 8, we're told it's the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. The year now is 551 BC. And we read chapter 8, verse 1, as I attempt to slow down here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. So we don't know if he was literally caught up and brought into the future, or if he's just moved in the Spirit and he was able to see these things of the future. But where we sit now, in 551 BC, is 9 years before the Medes and Persians come in and wipe out Babylon. But he sees what's about to happen. He's already told Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom would fall and the Medes and the Persians would come to power. And again, the Medes and the Persians, just two different ethnic groups. It's modern day Iran is what we're talking about here. Two different ethnicities in modern day Iran. And by the way, verse 20 will go on to tell us that these are the Medes and the Persians. That he'll identify them specifically. These are the Medes and Persians, and he'll say the Medes and the Persians are going to come in and wipe out Babylon. And he's going to make that very clear. And then he is also going to tell us that the second kingdom that will come after the Medes and the Persians will be the Greeks. He'll identify them specifically. And that's why people are just floored by Daniel's prophecy. That's why the skeptics will say, no, this couldn't have been written, before all these events unfolded. Because they're just so detailed. As we go deeper, he gets more and more detailed as to what's about to happen. Verse 3, then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram and two horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the two horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. So the Medes and the Persians, two horns, Medes and Persians. And initially, it was the Medes and Darius, who was, maybe I've got these backwards. But anyway, it was the Medes that were the stronger, but then the Persians would eventually take over and become the stronger of the two. You had the Darius, and then you had Cyrus. And again, we talked about this earlier. That Cyrus was named in Isaiah. Isaiah had given prophecies and mentioned Isaiah by name 200 years before he was even born. And it said it would be Cyrus who would come in and deliver Israel out of the hands of the Babylonians. And that's exactly what happened. And Cyrus would come in, he'd write a decree that they could go back to their hometown, their home city, Jerusalem, and rebuild their temple. And then later on, Artaxerxes would actually fund that rebuilding. So all these things are happening in detail as had been prophesied of. Where did I leave off? Okay, verse 4. And I saw a ram budding eastward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did what he pleased and magnified himself. And again, this is a 200 million man army. This is just rolling through, just annihilating anyone that stood in their path. While I was observing, verse 5, a male goat, which was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth. So now there was once a leopard, and a leopard, of course, is one of the fastest, if not the fastest creature on planet Earth. He was moving through very rapidly because he didn't have a 200 million man army. The Greeks had an army of 35,000. So logistically, they could move and conquer more quickly than the Medes and the Persians. But now he's described as a male goat. And it says that was coming from the east over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came up, verse 6, to the ram and that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed him in his mighty wrath. So again, this takes us now, jumps ahead to 334 BC. He describes this male goat. It just seemed to be, it's moving so fast that it appeared that it was not, was touching the ground. That's how quickly this goat was moving. And it attacks the ram with the two horns. This speaks of Alexander the Great, or the Greek army. He's coming in. He takes out the Medes and the Persians. He takes out Artaxerxes. So he comes in, again, 334 BC, this 35,000 man army is able to take out this million-man army. And it's kind of like, well, how is that possible? Well, today we know that this can happen through guerrilla warfare. Or, there's many. Not only that, as we shall see, Alexander the Great is simply a military genius. He was just the greatest leader that this world has known up to this time, as far as his ability to do with a small army what others were able to do with this ginormous army. So, in verse 7, I saw him come beside the ram, and he was engaged at him, and he struck the ram, shattered the two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. He hurled him, and so he hurled him to the ground and trampled him on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly. So this male goat, we now know, is Alexander the Great. Comes in, conquers the Medes and the Persians. Soon after he conquers the Medes and the Persians, he travels down, and he goes into Jerusalem. He surrounds Jerusalem. He's about to annihilate Jerusalem. But the priests have the prophecy of Daniel. They go out to meet Alexander the Great, and they say, look, all this is written by you. And Alexander is just that, he's just taken aback. He's baffled by this, and he's so moved by it that he spares Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, he goes on and conquers Egypt, and then eventually establishes the city of Alexandria in Egypt. From Egypt, he will come back and go into Afghanistan. He conquers Afghanistan, and then after conquering Afghanistan, he goes on to India, and after he conquers India, he falls into deep depression. Why does he fall into deep depression? Because he has no other kingdoms to conquer. He's like, man, I have nothing else to conquer. Poor pitiful me. He's 33 years old, and he's conquered the world. He's taken the world by storm, and he conquers it. It says, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in this place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds. So, he's conquered the king, and this speaks of his demise, and that's what we're about to get into, what actually happened to Alexander the Great. Once he conquers India, he goes back to Babylon, and he's bored. He decides, okay, I'm going to throw a big old party for my soldiers. He throws this big party for his soldiers, and then as the evening ends, he goes back home, and again, he's in Babylon at this point. He goes back home, but it's in the middle of a rainstorm. It's storming. He goes back home. He's drunk. He passes out. And somewhere within 3 days, he gets pneumonia, and he dies. But Alexander the Great was considered the greatest military strategist that was ever known. And it all began with his upbringing. Alexander the Great, his father, Philip, was a great military strategist in Macedonia. And I had to make some notes of this because I want to make sure I got my history correct. As he's growing up, his father knows there's something special about his son. And he starts focusing in on his son. But the thing is he's conquering these kingdoms. His son, Alexander, is growing and increasingly jealous of his father. He's looking at his father. He says, we're talking about a kid here who's 10, 11, 12, 13 years old is the history that we're about to unfold here. He's looking at his father, and at 10 or 12 years old, he says, and he's jealous of his father. He shares this with his family. He shares this with his neighbors of how jealous of his father is, because he's looking and he says, by the time I'm old enough to go out and conquer the world, my father would have already done it. But his father begins to see that there's something special about his son. He sees his son as being very gifted. And so what his father chooses to do is to go out and get the greatest mind of the day, the greatest scholar of the day, a philosopher by the name of Aristotle. And Aristotle begins to tutor Alexander the Great. And he becomes well educated. He becomes well versed in the countries of the world. And it was in the midst of all this, Alexander the Great also, as he increased in his intelligence, as he increased in his wisdom, his father wanted to reward him. So his father gets him this black stallion. The stallion that was not, that no man has been able to tame or yet even ride at this point. But Alexander takes this gift from his father, this stallion, and he hops on this stallion, and he's able almost immediately tame it and ride it. Now his father Philip sees Alexander the Great upon this black stallion, and he's like, man, this child has got something. He tells his son, now you go out and conquer a great nation. Well, Alexander the Great begins to go out and to conquer. He conquers all of Greece by the age of 20. And as he's out conquering Greece, as he goes on beyond the Greek borders at the age of 20, the rebellion rose up in Thebes. And what does Alexander the Great do? He's been out, and now he's got rebellion. He goes into Thebes and destroys every building in that city. He kills nearly every man, woman, and child. He leaves only 35,000 remaining. And with these 35,000, he sells them into slavery. He sent a message to all of Greece. Don't mess with me. And the Greeks would, they would submit themselves to Alexander the Great. And even, it didn't matter how long he was gone. Sometimes he was gone 3 years. Sometimes he was gone 5 years. Greece, there was no rebellion in Greece because they knew what Alexander the Great would do. Again, he was brilliant. He was a military strategist. He's what the world defines as a true leader. Now, what I want to do in our closing here is contrast Alexander the Great, a man who died at 33 years old, with another man who died at 33 years of age. There's a contrast here. There is a comparison. They both died at 33, but that's the extent of the comparison. There's a contrast. And a contrast of what the world would declare as a great leader and what our Heavenly Father declares as a great leader. Alexander the Great was a man who would, because of his great pride, declare himself as God. A man declares himself to be God. In contrast, Jesus was God, is God. But he steps down out of heaven and becomes a man. Alexander the Great grew very jealous of his father. Jesus, on the other hand, was not someone who grew very jealous of his father. He says, I have come to do the will of my Father. He says, what I aim to do is what pleases my Father. Alexander the Great, by the age of 13, was being tutored by Aristotle, the greatest scholar of the day. Jesus, on the other hand, by the age of 12, was in the temple schooling the greatest scholars of the day. Alexander the Great shed the blood of millions for his own personal glory. Jesus, on the other hand, came to shed his own personal blood for our salvation. Alexander the Great wiped out the city of Thebes because they had rebelled against him. Jesus, as he's looking over Jerusalem, a city that he came to save, was rebelling against him. And what does he do? He weeps over the city and ends up dying for the city. Alexander the Great was the conqueror who rode in on this great black stallion. Jesus, in his conquering, humbly rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Alexander the Great was a man who was quoted as saying, "Friend, you must die." Because his friend had made some advances toward his wife. Jesus turns to his friend, Judas Iscariot. He turns to Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed him. He says, "Friend, what do you really want?" Jesus should I say Alexander the Great, he died in Babylon, was buried in Babylon, and then his body was eventually taken into Egypt, where it was buried again, and then eventually moved to Alexandria, where this great memorial was erected in his memory. Jesus died, was buried, and his body was moved by his own strength and power, but it was never buried again. He now sits in heaven to intercede for all of us. Alexander the Great was simply a memory. Jesus is not a memory. He's real. He's alive. He's interceding. And as we shall see, as we've seen in Daniel's vision, you know, the stone that comes and destroys the kingdom, then as the Roman Empire comes to power, we see Jesus comes in and immediately destroys it with a single word. Jesus Christ is coming back. And he's come to establish his kingdom on earth, a kingdom that will never end. Amen? Heavenly Father, we thank you for loving us. We thank you for dying for us. We thank you for these prophecies. Lord, may we take these prophecies to heart. Prophecies, many of which have already unfolded, but we know that it's also telling us a story of what will come in the future. It's telling us what will take place. And Lord, because they have been fulfilled in the past, we can rest assured that those remaining will be fulfilled.